So we've been journeying for 2 weeks through Advent so far, although with the kids' service last week, it does feel like we've only done 1 week, doesn't it? So the first week we did a sermon looking at John the Baptist. Even though John the Baptist is not a traditional person that we would normally have in the Christmas story, we talked about how John the Baptist was encouraging us to prepare the way for the Lord. And then last week we had the great joy with the kids as we celebrated the birth in nativity form, but also with the animals of what Isaiah talked about, this wonderful counselor, this mighty God, this everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. We're actually going to allow John to continue to speak to us a little bit today through in our journey. And before I get to that, I just got to spend a bit of time talking about translations. You know the Bible was not written in English, don't you? It was written in Hebrew and in Greek. And over the years, different people have translated that into different languages. Like it was first translated into Latin in 382 CE and then translated into English in 1611 CE. What was the first English translation? The King James Bible? No, it wasn't, was it? No, there's one before that. Tyndale. Yes. Oh, gee. I should have just kept with my words on the screen and not tried to ad-lib. Now, translators do an amazing job. I really think they do an amazing job. And they're still translating the Bible into languages right around the world. But sometimes they have some issues in context. And it's not necessarily their fault, because we grow up in a context and we understand things in a certain way. And when we read words, we read it in a certain way because of the context that we grew up in. And certainly the early translators had some problems when they just didn't quite get the context. They thought they were translating words, or they were translating words correctly, but sometimes missed the context. And the Christmas story is a good example of that. And we talked about this in the kids' talk last week, the one that Kathy from the Turramurra read out for us. This verse where it says, she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in cloths, and laid him in a manger because there was no room for them to stay in the inn. If you're translating that as an English person and you read those words, you go, I've got it. You know, I understand what an inn is. We have inns here. I understand where the manger, the animal trough is. It's in the barn out the back of the inn. And so we get this picture of Jesus being born in a stable behind the inn because there was no room in the inn, which is the picture I've got on the screen that I've been using all of Advent, is that picture of the stable out the back. And yet anybody reading it from a Middle Eastern point of view would go, that's not how it works. In our culture, in our context, we don't have barns out the back. That's not how it works. The animals don't sleep out the back. They sleep in the house with us. And we actually had these pictures in the kids' talk last week, if you remember them. The animals sleep on the ground, and then there's a raised platform where the people sleep, and then there's a guest room because hospitality was huge back in those culture. And so the guest room, the Greek word for guest room is kataluma, which can be translated as guest room, or it can be translated as inn. And so that verse that we read, which says, she gave birth to her first son, wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, for there was no room for them in the inn. A person from a Middle Eastern culture would go, there's no room for them in the kataluma, in the guest room. The guest room was full. And possibly the platform might have been full of people too. But Jesus was born in that room where the animals sleep, because that's where the manger is, and that's where Jesus was laid after he was born. So can you see the slight difference? But it's because we think from a certain cultural perspective that we get these other pictures. Why is that important? Well, it happens today again with the word wilderness. I want to pick up on this word wilderness. You know, we looked at in that first week of Advent, John the Baptist saying, "A voice is calling the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord." But when we think of wilderness, what do we think of? You know, I've got this picture of the Blue Mountains, far away from civilization. You know, this idea of wilderness is this place a long way away, untouched by people, you know, natural beauty, but a long way from anything. We have that picture. Yet that's not the way that people from Jesus' time understood the word wilderness. That's how we understand it. The Greek word for wilderness is eremos. And for them, it's this feeling of being isolated or alone. It's a place of dryness, either literally, because there were dry places around where they lived, but also this idea of spiritually dry, lacking in life, being disconnected or far from God was also a place of wilderness for them. And why we have this understanding, you know, when John the Baptist is supposed to be in the wilderness preaching, he was at the Jordan River, which whilst wasn't in a major town, is not actually that far from where all the action is. It's not like the Blue Mountains, way away from civilization. The Jordan River's near where everything happens. Here's a picture on the screen of the Jordan River, and you can see farmland right next to it. You can see people living up and down the Jordan River. It was a river. People lived near it. And so he was not necessarily preaching where nobody was. He was preaching in the wilderness. Maybe he was preaching from a place where he felt disconnected or feeling spiritually dry. But more likely, he was preaching to a people who were disconnected from God, who were spiritually dry, who were lacking in life. Does that make sense? It just brings a totally different perspective of what John was trying to do. He was preaching from, or more likely to, a people in the wilderness. A voice was calling in the wilderness. So we come to Advent, and I just want to ask the question, this idea of wilderness being a place being disconnected, spiritually dry, a place maybe of struggle, I'll ask the question, is there any other stories in the Bible of people wandering through the wilderness? Well, I'm going to tell you, I've come up with 5 or 6 on my next screen. But I want you to have a 90-second conversation with the people around you and see if you can guess one of my 5 or 6. I'll give you a clue. John the Baptist is one of them. Don't use John the Baptist. But can you think of any other stories in the Bible that include people being in the wilderness, feeling like they're in the wilderness, wandering in the wilderness, disconnected from God? You can do that if you're watching online as well. Write it in the comment section so I can see how you're going with that. I've lost my... Here we go. All right. So let's see if you've got what I've got. If you're honest, you can, put your hand up and say, yes. I forgot that slide. Yeah, anyway. So I've got John the Baptist. Did anyone else have Moses or Joshua? Oh, come on. We preached on that, about 4 weeks ago? They were wandering in the desert. Did anybody have Jacob? Jacob had a big fallout with his brother and escaped into the wilderness to hide because he was worried his brother was going to kill him. And he describes it like being in the wilderness. I also had David. David describes his experience of running away from Saul in that period between being anointed as king but waiting to become king as like a period in the wilderness. He was on the run the whole time. I had Paul. Paul a number of times talks about feeling, that separation, that feeling of, where is God in all of this sort of stuff. And did anyone have the last one that I had, which was Jesus, the other obvious one? Did anyone have more than that? There is plenty more. Yeah, we won't get you to yell it all out, but like the Bible is full of these stories. There are lots of people who go through these moments when they feel spiritually dry or struggling, which is actually slightly encouraging to us. Because if you're going through a time where you're feeling a bit spiritually dry or disconnected, suddenly you look at these names on this list and go, well, they're superheroes of the Bible, and they all felt the same way. So then suddenly you begin to realize this wilderness experience is not necessarily a failure on our behalf, but it's actually something that the people of God go through every now and again. I actually had 3 of them in the Christmas story. Did anyone find any in the Christmas story? I had Joseph in the Bible reading today. When Joseph was first told that Mary was pregnant, what did he want to do? Oh, this isn't right. I'm going to divorce her quietly and get out of this. He was full of doubt until the angel came and reassured him that this was okay. The Magi literally had to travel through the wilderness to find the Christ child. And I also had the story of Jesus and being a refugee in Egypt. After Jesus was born and the death threats of King Herod, they escaped through the wilderness, sort of like going the backwards journey that Moses and Joshua took back to Egypt to hide there until King Herod died. There's wilderness experiences even in the Christmas story as well. Which is funny because we expect Christmas to be all happy and joyful and jolly and everything joyous. That's what we're looking at today, isn't it? And yet in the Christmas story, there are stories of doubts and confusion and, struggle and wilderness experiences as well. And yet there is something that we discover not only in these Christmas stories, but in all the stories that we are on the screen, and possibly all the stories you'll find in the Bible as well. The irony that often happens is that when people are in a place of wilderness, in a place of spiritual dryness or disconnection, what do they discover? They discover God. They discover that God is near to them in the wilderness. In the wilderness. You don't believe me? What was John saying when he was crying out in the wilderness? He was hinting that the kingdom of God is coming near. Actually, they're Jesus' words. But he was hinting that God was coming to us. That God was coming to us. Every day that Moses and Joshua were in the wilderness, God showed up and gave provision through the manna and the quail. Literally showed them a pillar of fire and cloud to remind them on their God's presence. When Jacob was wrestling in the wilderness, he actually made this line. He said, God was in this place and I never knew. God was here and I never realized, he says. During David's time of struggle, he learnt that profound trust in God that actually played out so much in his kingship. The Apostle Paul, you just got to read his letters, and there is verse after verse of saying, even in the difficult times, he has discovered the grace and the presence of God. Joseph, in his doubts, was reassured that indeed this was part of God's plan. The time that Mary and Joseph and Jesus spent in Egypt would have been very difficult, but it kept them safe. It was part of that wilderness experience that actually allowed the rest of the journey to continue. The Magi did indeed have to travel through the wilderness to draw near and find the newborn king. And even Jesus, during his time in the wilderness, at the very end of it, what does it say? He was ministered to in the wilderness. In all these stories, God comes near. Maybe that's the lesson that we need to learn. If you're feeling like you're feeling spiritually dry at the moment or disconnected at the moment, or there's just too much happening at the moment and you're going, it's just too hard. Maybe we need to hear the words that the angel said to Joseph in the dream. That idea of, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. God is at work. We're not quite sure how God is at work in the wilderness, because sometimes it doesn't feel like God's at work, or it doesn't feel like God's close. But the angel said, God is at work here. Even if you're not understanding, God is at work. God has not forgotten about you. God knows what's going on and is at work. And then the angel went on to say, you need to remember that Jesus, well, he said to Joseph, Jesus is coming near. He actually used the word Emmanuel to Joseph. Jesus is coming near. But we're on the other side of the story. So I could say, Jesus is near. Even in the wilderness, Jesus is near. And maybe that's what we need to remember, the promise of Jesus, the name that was given in that dream, Emmanuel, that God is with us today, forever, in the good times and in the wilderness. God is near. God is with us. Amen.